Welcome back to Dano Does Things. My name is Dano, and today is the first video in a, I think, 3-part video series that I am going to be doing. This all started when I went to the thrift store and I found a pattern for a cloak, and I thought, this is obviously a sign that I need to make myself a cloak. And as I was thinking about it, I thought it'd be really fun to do a whole outfit based off of the cloak. Now it is fall, which is one of my favorite seasons, so I thought I would incorporate that into this project as well. This project will consist of 3 different pieces. It'll be the outer cloak, the dress and other under things, and a felt crown. I've made a felt crown before and I really loved it. It was super fun, so I'm excited to make this one as well. Now today's video will be the cloak part of the project. I went to the fabric store. I was very grateful because a local fabric store near me was having a sort of open house and I was able to get some really lovely fabric on sale. This is the color of the Melton here. It is so gorgeous. It's a sort of rusty orange, very fall color, and I'm very excited to work with it. Melton can be a little expensive. Like I said, I was very, very lucky to be able to get some discounts on this one because for a cloak, obviously, it's going to be a full-length cloak, so you need a lot of fabric for it. So I was very happy to be able to get some on sale. Even so, it was fairly expensive for, usually I get fabric from the thrift store, like I buy sheets and cut them up. So this is the first time I've spent a chunk of money on fabric. So I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little nervous about getting into this, but I'm also very excited. The cloak is a fairly simple pattern, thankfully. It's only like a couple of pieces put together and no real fancy stitches. So I think it's gonna be okay. I know the first cut into it is gonna be nerve-wracking, but that's all right. Okay, the lighting was fine when I started this and now it's being weird, but that's okay because we're just going to get into this cape project and yeah, let's get started. Here is the pattern that I will be working with today. It is supposed to be very easy, which is great because I am very much an amateur sewer and I haven't worked with a lot of patterns. I am making Cloak A, and I was only able to get 4 3/4 yards of Melton wool in the color that I wanted, and that is the minimum size for fabric with naps, so I very much lucked out. I got this gorgeous dark rusty orange Melton, which is a medium heavyweight wool fabric, and I've read that it's amazing for outerwear, so it'll be perfect for my cloak. I also grabbed some matching thread. I actually grabbed 2 spools, which was great hindsight because I definitely used both of them. Now, wool Melton needs to be pre-shrunk, but you should never wash Melton in the washing machine. You can get it dry cleaned, but I already spent all my money on fabric, so instead I'm going to steam it with my iron on the wool setting. Always make sure to check the settings on your own iron before you use it on new fabrics. Even better, test it on a small piece of fabric. Next, I was figuring out what pieces of the pattern I needed to make my cloak, as there is 2 different patterns in here. Once I found the right pieces, number 1, 2, and 3 in this pattern, and while I had the iron out, I also gave my pattern pieces a little smooth out on the lowest setting, just to get some of the major creases out to make it easier to use. I also had to trim the pattern down to the size that I needed. Now it was time to lay out my pieces on the fabric, but since I do not have a cutting table and this piece of fabric is massive, I had to rearrange my whole house. Then I laid out my pattern pieces to make sure they fit, following the guide on the pattern to ensure I was laying the straight edges of the cloak along the grain line. The fabric is also folded over so I get 2 of each piece. The hood of the cloak is self-lining, which means I need to cut out the 1 pattern piece twice, which means I get 4 pieces of fabric that'll look the same. Once I had everything laid out and spaced correctly, then I had to pin down each pattern piece through both layers of fabric to make sure nothing moved around while I was cutting. This pattern also doesn't include seam allowances, so I went around and added a 5/8 inch seam allowance around each piece as per the pattern's instructions. Some patterns do include seam allowances and some don't, so always make sure you read through the whole pattern before you start. As well, remember to transfer any pattern marks onto your fabric. I am using a chalk pen here. Finally, everything was all cut out and my body was aching from crawling around the floor for a few hours, but it was done and it was time to actually start sewing. But first, I wanted to test that my machine could actually sew through this thick wool because my machine kinda sucks. And it's basically a kid's playtime sewing machine, but it easily went through the 2 layers and even went through 3 layers of fabric quite nicely, much to my surprise. I could already tell the wool was going to be really amazing to work with at this point. I also had to wind my bobbin with some new matching thread. And with that done, it is now actually time to start sewing. Now the first piece to go together is the 2 back pieces. They'll be attached along the straight edge and then pressed to one side and top stitched. I really love the detail of the top stitch on this pattern, especially on the wool Melton. It gives it a very professional coat vibe. Also a note that I won't necessarily be finishing the seams on the inside, the top stitch will be the only real finishing. I played around with some finishing, but the Melton was too thick for a lot of the kinds of finishing I know how to do, but Melton, as I've read, doesn't really fray, so I'm going with it. With the first 2 panels attached, I wanted to see how long the cloak actually was, so I lined up the shoulder seams with my shoulders to get an idea. And at this point, I was happy to be forced to use the petite size because it turns out I am very short and this cape is just skimming the floor, which is perfect. Up next is to attach the front panels to the back along the shoulder/side seams. A note, when I first pinned the side seams, I ended up accidentally stretching the one side of the fabric a lot and had a lot of extra fabric at the bottom. I went back and actually lined up the seam markings and didn't pull too hard and everything lined up just fine. So just a friendly reminder to use your seam markers. The next step was to put a hem around the bottom of the cloak and the front opening. And of course, as any sewer with a cat knows, Dory here wasn't going to make any of this easy for me. But after a quick bribe with some treats, I got my cloak back. Now, I debated a lot about what to do with the hem. The instructions say to do a narrow hem, folding over once and pressing, unfolding, and then tucking the raw hem up and under. However, with the Melton, the double rolled hem was feeling very thick and looked really bulky, and the Melton also doesn't hold a press very well, so it was kind of hard to follow that. So instead, I just leaned back on the Melton, not really fraying, and did just a single turn under for the hem. As for the corners, here's how I did them. I folded the point of the corner towards the middle and then tucked the hem over. You may need to fiddle a bit with the point length before you get the right length so the sides fold in nicely and create this little diagonal corner. Now it was time to sew along the whole hem, and it was at this point that I was very grateful to have 2 spools of matching thread because that bottom hem is long, which is going to make our cloak super swishy and spinny later on, but for now we just have to spend a long time hemming. When you get to the corners, sew right to that folded corner and make sure your needle is down and in the fabric right in the middle. Lift up the presser foot and spin your fabric so the next hem is lined up. Put down your presser foot and keep on sewing forever along the hem. Now that the hem is finally done, we are going to stay stitch around the neck hole. This pattern calls for a stitch 1/8 of an inch in from the seam line, so measuring from the seam line towards the raw edge. This means that my stitch was about 1/2 an inch from the raw edge. Then we are moving on to the hood. First up, I need to put the tucks in all 4 of the pieces. These rectangular marks show where the tucks will be. The sides of the rectangles need to be stitched together, so to help line that up, I used 3 pins poking through on the left line and then out on the right. That way, when you squish the tuck together, everything is all nicely lined up, and I can secure that with another pin, knowing my lines will match. Dory happily helped with this step as well. I then sewed up all 12 tucks. Finally, I gave them all a press towards the back of the hood. Now, since the Melton doesn't hold a press super well, I basted down the tucks so they would stay in the right direction while I finished the rest of the cloak. Now I am starting to assemble the hood. First comes attaching the pieces together with right sides together and then top stitching, same as we did on the back panels. I'll repeat for the other 2 hood pieces and we'll end up with 2 identical hoods, one which will be turned into the lining. Now the bottom hem of the lining hood will be turned up along the seam allowance and pressed. And as you may have guessed, the melt-in didn't hold the press very well, so I basted this seam as well to keep it in place. I also gave the seam a trim to reduce some bulk around the neck. Then I lined up the lining hood and the other hood piece along the front edge opening. Now I definitely stood in front of the camera for most of this part, but hopefully you can see, since the top seam of each was pressed and top stitched the same way, now that they're put together they're going the opposite way, which means they are offset when you attach them. This helps to reduce some of the bulk, but just keep that in mind when you're lining up the seam. Once the two hood sections are attached, I flipped them right side out and pressed along the front opening. Now came the fun part of attaching the hood to the cape. Definitely the hardest step of the whole process. This cloak is kind of giant and a bit cumbersome, which made this a bit of a struggle. But I laid the cloak down right side up and then lined up the hood section. Now I'm only working with the outside hood section, keeping the lining section, which is the slightly shorter section, free. The outside hood gets lined up to the neckline, right sides together, and pinned together. With the tucks in the hood, this was a pretty thick seam, so I decided to not break my sewing machine and do this part by hand. I did a back stitch along the seam, making sure it was super secure. Once it was attached, it was quite late at night by then, and Dory decided it was cuddle time, so I finished up for the day. The next morning I was about to seal up the hood lining, but decided to first trim the seam along the face opening so that there was less bulk and it would lay a bit better around my face. Then I turned the hood back so it was right side out and then pressed the neckline seam up towards the hood. Now I took the hood lining and pinned it to the neckline, making sure to sandwich the raw neck seam up inside the hood. I then hand sewed the hood lining down using a slip stitch, making sure that my stitches didn't come through the back of the cloak. I made lots of fairly small stitches so it would be nice and strong. With the matching thread, this seam should be basically invisible from both sides, giving you a nice seamless look. Once that was done, I gave the entire cloak a good press. When I first started sewing, I will admit that I often ignored the pressing steps, but it really does help to make everything look nice and professional. The last step was making a fastener. I decided on using a big button from an old coat that I had years ago and making a fabric loop to put it through. First, I cut a 1-inch strip of fabric, which I then folded over and sewed a straight line down the middle, trimming the excess seam. I then looped the fabric and attached it on one side of the cloak, making sure it would just barely fit my button. You don't want it too loose or the button will slip out. You may have to adjust it once you put the cloak on and see how secure it feels. I'm going to sew along the seam line of the hem so you don't see any extra sewing on the right side where this loop is attached. Finally, I attached the button very securely and then my cloak was done. Well, that is it. That was my cloak in action. Thank you to my parents for letting me use their yard, and especially my mom for throwing leaves and taking some pictures of me. Very much appreciate that. I was going to use my yard, but my neighbors were out cleaning their garden and it was just a little awkward. Overall, I am super happy with how this project came out. It turned out pretty much exactly how I was thinking in my head. Now, the only thing I would really change, I think, is the clasp and the button here. I might add some like hooks and eyes to do sort of like a longer closure just to make it sit a little better, but we'll play with that. We'll see. That's an easy thing to fix. I was nervous about using this fabric because it is a more expensive fabric. I picked up another shift at my second job so that I could buy this fabric, but honestly, it was a treat to work with. It was so nice and buttery and just ran through my machine really well. Of course, there were parts where it was like too thick to go through my machine and I did have to hand stitch that, but that was totally fine. Absolutely okay with that. The finishing turned out really well. I feel like the little corners on the edges and especially the inside part of the hood came out really awesome. I would say if I was going to make the pattern again, I might adjust the hood because it is a bit big. But it's kind of cute. It's kind of cool. I like the style for this, but if I was going to make like a everyday cloak, is that a thing? I would maybe adjust the hood a bit, but honestly, I'm super proud of this project and I cannot wait to finish the rest of this sort of outfit. Next week, I am going to be working on the dress, and then after that, I will be working on the crown, and it'll all come together into my little fall elf costume, and I am very excited to show you that. Oh, I hope my microphone is not being rattled around by this cloak too much. Okay. So yeah, I'm super happy with this project, and I hope you stick around to see how the whole thing turns out. If you're enjoying this project so far, please give this video a thumbs up or subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.